Snow had a way of silencing the world. It muffled footsteps, buried cars, and wrapped entire towns in a blanket of stillness. On the night the storm rolled into Maplewood, a small town tucked deep into the mountains, silence turned into suffocation. The wind howled like an untamed beast, rattling windows and bending trees until their limbs snapped. Inside a modest wooden house on the outskirts of town, Margaret Collins lit another candle. The power had gone out hours ago. The old furnace sputtered now and then, fighting against the biting cold that tried to seep through every crack in her 100-year-old home. Margaret was no stranger to hardship. At 58, she had lived most of her life working as a housekeeper in wealthier people's homes. For decades, she scrubbed marble floors, polished silver cutlery, ironed silk sheets, and raised her 2 children alone after her husband died young. Now, her children were grown and living far away. She lived quietly alone, earning just enough to get by cleaning a few houses around town. That night, with snow piling knee-deep outside and the storm showing no mercy, Margaret prepared for a long, lonely evening. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and boiled water for tea. She thought she might ride out the storm by the fireplace, maybe reread one of the old books she had borrowed from the library. But then came the knock. At first, she thought it was the storm itself, something hitting the door, a branch perhaps. But then she heard it again, knock, knock, knock. Faint, hesitant but human. Margaret's heart jumped. Who could possibly be out there in this weather? She hurried to the door, pulled it open, and nearly gasped. A man stood there, his coat dusted white with snow, his hair wet and matted against his forehead. His face was pale with cold, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he stammered, his breath fogging the icy air. "My car, it slid off the road. I can't make it back to town. May I?" Without a second thought, Margaret stepped aside. "Get in here before you freeze to death." The man stumbled in, stamping snow from his boots. He looked like no ordinary traveler. His coat alone looked like it cost more than her monthly wages. His leather gloves, though wet, were designer. And when he removed them, she noticed a gold watch that gleamed even in the dim candlelight. "Thank you," he whispered, shivering. "I didn't know where else to go." Margaret quickly set him by the fire, poured him hot tea, and fetched an extra blanket. "You'll be all right," she assured him. "The storm's only just begun. Best stay put until it passes." The man nodded, grateful. After a few sips of tea, he finally introduced himself. "David Lancaster," he said, extending a trembling hand. Margaret shook it gently. "Margaret Collins." Something flickered in his expression when he looked around the small, tidy home. It wasn't pity, but it was certainly surprise. He was used to penthouses and chandeliers, not hand-sewn curtains and creaky wooden floors. But before Margaret could ask him where he came from, another knock rattled the door. She turned, startled. Who on earth? She opened the door again, and this time 2 women stood outside, clinging to each other, their faces flushed red from the cold. Their coats were stylish, fur-lined, the kind you saw on magazine covers. Behind them, barely visible through the curtain of snow, a sleek black car sat abandoned at the roadside. "Please," one of the women gasped. "Our driver lost control. The car won't start. We saw the light in your window." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Come in, quickly." Soon, the small living room was filled with more coats, more boots dripping with melted snow, and more strangers who seemed far too refined to be stranded in a town like Maplewood. One after another they arrived. 5, 6, then 10. By midnight, 15 strangers sat huddled in Margaret's home, warming their hands by the fire, sipping tea, and marveling at her simple hospitality. 15 millionaires. Though Margaret had no idea just yet. To her they were simply people in need. The storm outside howled on, but inside her little house, warmth spread not only from the fire but from the quiet, unlikely gathering that fate had brought to her doorstep. Margaret, though exhausted, looked at them all and said gently, "You're safe here. That's what matters." But little did she know, this night, this simple act of kindness, would change her life forever. The storm worsened through the night, pounding against the windows like fists of ice. The wind wailed down the chimney, but inside Margaret's small house, the air was heavy with warmth, not only from the fire but from the strange collection of people gathered under her roof. Her living room, usually quiet and neatly kept, looked almost unrecognizable. Wet boots lined the wall. Coats hung dripping from chairs. The fire flickered against expensive leather bags, diamond earrings, and polished watches that seemed out of place in her humble cottage. Margaret moved among them, pouring tea, handing out blankets, checking if anyone needed more wood for the fire. She worked without complaint, the way she always had. To her, they weren't important or rich. They were just people, shivering, frightened, and far away from comfort. But to each of the strangers, Margaret was an enigma. She didn't ask their names. She didn't ask for money. She didn't question how or why they ended up in her tiny town. She simply served them as though they were long-lost guests expected all along. David Lancaster, the first man who had knocked, kept watching her carefully. He wasn't used to being treated like everyone else. Usually, people recognized him instantly. Billionaire investor, the man whose name flashed on stock tickers around the world. But Margaret didn't recognize him. To her he was just David, a stranded traveler with wet gloves and cold hands. Next to him sat the two women Margaret had taken in, Claire and Vanessa, fashion magnates from London known globally for their luxury clothing line. Here, stripped of their entourage, their stylists and their press teams, they looked oddly human. Vanessa sneezed into the corner of her sleeve, and Claire whispered complaints about her ruined boots. Yet, when Margaret offered them both thick wool socks from her late husband's drawer, their glamorous defenses softened. One by one more names emerged. A venture capitalist from Toronto, a Silicon Valley app developer whose face had been splashed across Forbes just months ago. A retired football star turned real estate tycoon, a shipping magnate from New York, 15 in total, 15 millionaires, huddled like lost children in the living room of a woman whose entire savings wouldn't equal the price of a single one of their watches. Margaret knew none of it. Best we make do, she said as she spread more blankets across the floor. I don't have enough beds for everyone. Some of you will need to sleep close to the fire. There was no protest, no one demanded special treatment. In fact, the absurdity of the situation seemed to humble them. The storm had stripped them of the power their money usually carried. Out here in this modest wooden house they were equals. But equality didn't mean comfort. Vanessa was the first to whisper her complaint. I've never slept on a floor before. I don't even know if my back can handle it. The football star chuckled. Don't worry, princess. I'll trade you my blanket for that fancy fur coat you're wearing. The others laughed and soon the mood began to lighten. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. A few of them leaned back sipping their tea and started sharing stories, not about money or business deals but about simple things, childhood winters. The first car they ever drove. The first job they ever worked before wealth came into their lives. Margaret sat quietly in her chair, listening, knitting with her old wooden needles. Every now and then, one of them would glance at her. The way she moved so calmly, as though hosting a room full of millionaires was the most ordinary thing in the world. It wasn't long before David leaned forward and asked the question none of them had dared to voice. Mrs. Collins, he said gently, aren't you worried? 15 strangers showing up at your door in the middle of a storm. Margaret looked up from her knitting, her face soft but steady. You were cold. Hungry, in trouble. What's there to worry about? The room fell silent for a moment. Most of them weren't used to such a simple view of life. In their world, trust had to be earned, loyalty was rare, and generosity often came with strings attached. Margaret added, besides, kindness has a way of coming back around. Always has. The words lingered in the room. Hours passed. The storm raged on, but inside the atmosphere shifted. The millionaires began to reveal things they never would have in boardrooms or magazine interviews. Claire confessed she hadn't spoken to her family in over a year. The tech developer admitted that despite his billions, he felt lonelier than ever. The football star, his body broken from years on the field, said money hadn't bought him peace. They weren't talking to the world. They were talking to Margaret. A woman who didn't care about their fortunes, only their humanity. And it startled them. By the time the clock struck 2 in the morning, most had dozed off, sprawled on the floor, curled in blankets, or leaning against the furniture. The storm outside howled on, but inside the house had become something unexpected, a shelter not just from the snow, but from the weight each of them carried in silence. Margaret stoked the fire one last time and whispered to herself, Lord, keep them safe tonight. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know the storm outside would change her life forever. She only knew that in her small, fragile way, she had done the right thing. And as the snow piled higher and the wind screamed through the mountains, 15 millionaires slept soundly in the care of a woman who owned almost nothing, but gave everything she had. Morning came slowly. A pale gray light filtered through frosted windows, and the storm had not let up. Snow had piled so high it nearly covered the small picket fence outside. The wind had eased slightly, but the storm's grip was far from broken. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Margaret had risen early, moving quietly around her kitchen. She ground the beans by hand, boiled water over the fire, and sliced bread she had baked the day before. She worked with steady rhythm, careful not to wake her unusual guests. One by one they stirred. At first with groans, stretches, and the kind of disoriented blinking that comes from sleeping on a hard floor. For many of them, it was the first time in decades, perhaps ever, that they'd slept without silk sheets or a luxury mattress beneath them. Claire was the first to speak. My back feels like it's been trampled by elephants. The football star chuckled. Now you know how I feel every day. Laughter rippled through the room. Despite the discomfort, there was something oddly refreshing about the experience. Stripped of their comforts, they felt human again. But the culture clash was impossible to ignore. When Margaret carried in a tray of mismatched mugs filled with steaming coffee, Vanessa hesitated. Do you have oat milk? She asked, almost apologetically. Margaret smiled kindly. I'm afraid it's just regular milk. From the farm down the road. Vanessa flushed, realizing how ridiculous the question sounded here, in the middle of a snowstorm. She accepted the mug, muttered a thank you and took a sip. To her surprise, it was the best coffee she'd had in months. Meanwhile, the venture capitalist frowned at the bread Margaret set on the table. No butter. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Storm took out the power yesterday. The fridge is done for. Bread and jam will have to do. He stared for a moment, then picked up a slice and took a bite. Sweet, tart, simple, unlike the artisanal spreads he was used to. Yet something about it made him take another and another. Not all adjusted so easily. The tech developer muttered about needing Wi-Fi. The shipping magnate grumbled about missed meetings. Even David Lancaster checked his watch more times than necessary, as though trying to measure the hours he was losing. Margaret noticed it all, but she didn't comment. Instead, she simply said, sometimes life makes you slow down whether you like it or not. Might as well enjoy it. Her words silenced them more effectively than any lecture could. Later in the day, Margaret asked a few of the stronger men to help her fetch more firewood from the shed out back. They grumbled, but followed her. The wind cut bitterly as they trudged through the snow, their designer coats caked with frost. The football star grabbed an axe, splitting logs with practiced ease. The venture capitalist looked utterly helpless holding one. David, to everyone's surprise, worked silently and efficiently, carrying armfuls of wood back into the house without complaint. Inside, the women helped Margaret peel potatoes and chop vegetables for soup. Claire, used to being served by personal chefs, fumbled with the knife at first. Vanessa wrinkled her nose at the smell of onions clinging to her hands. But gradually, the kitchen filled with laughter, the clatter of knives against cutting boards, and the smell of hearty stew bubbling over the fire. Can't remember the last time I cooked for myself, Vanessa admitted, stirring the pot. Then you've been missing out, Margaret said with a smile. By evening the storm still showed no signs of breaking. But inside something had shifted. The millionaires, people who lived in glass towers, penthouses, and sprawling estates, were learning to live like Margaret. They sat cross-legged on the floor, eating soup from chipped bowls. They fetched water from the pump outside. They huddled together under blankets, sharing stories instead of staring at screens. And it wasn't misery, it was liberating. Still, not all was peaceful. The venture capitalist, growing restless, snapped at Margaret. Don't you realize what kind of people you've got here? Do you have any idea the kind of money sitting in this room? Margaret looked at him calmly. Doesn't matter to me. Storm doesn't care how much money you've got in your wallet. Right now you're just people trying to stay warm. The room went quiet again. Even the fire seemed to pop louder in the silence. David spoke then, his voice measured. She's right. Money can't buy you out of this storm. Maybe it's time we stop acting like it can. The venture capitalist muttered something under his breath but didn't argue further. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and the fire glowed low, something extraordinary was happening. Slowly, the walls the millionaires carried, walls of pride, wealth, and power, began to crumble, and Margaret, the humble housekeeper who had welcomed them without question, stood at the center of it all, not commanding, not lecturing, simply living her truth and letting her quiet kindness do the rest. For the first time in years, some of them felt human again. And though none of them realized it yet, this storm wasn't just trapping them in Margaret's home. It was trapping them inside a moment that would change all their lives forever. By the third day, the storm had swallowed the entire town. Roads were impassable, power lines still down, and silence hung heavy outside except for the groaning of snow-laden trees. Yet, inside Margaret's home, something remarkable had begun to bloom. It started with the soup. Margaret had stretched her supplies farther than anyone thought possible. With a few carrots, potatoes, and onions from her cellar, she made hearty stew enough for everyone. She served it in chipped bowls, apologizing for the lack of refinement. Don't apologize, said David, spooning it eagerly. This is better than most meals I've had at banquets. Claire nodded, savoring it slowly. Honestly, it tastes like home. Those words struck Margaret. Home. That was what she wanted her house to be, no matter how small or modest. And somehow these strangers, these millionaires, were beginning to feel it too. Later that morning, Margaret noticed Vanessa trying to wash her mug at the sink. The faucet sputtered, the water came cold, and Vanessa frowned. Margaret walked over, rolling up her sleeves. Pump outside froze overnight. We'll need to heat some snow for washing. Vanessa blinked. You boil snow? Margaret chuckled. When you live here long enough you learn a few tricks. To her surprise, Vanessa followed her outside with a bucket. The snow bit at their cheeks, but Vanessa didn't complain. She filled the pail clumsily, then laughed at herself. Margaret laughed too. And the two women, one who owned half a fashion empire and one who scrubbed floors for a living, walked back inside as though they had been friends for years. By noon the storm showed no sign of ending. To keep spirits up, Margaret suggested they all work together on chores. You'll keep warmer if you keep busy, she said. The men hauled more firewood. The women helped with mending blankets and tidying up. The retired football star even managed to fix a broken leg on one of Margaret's old chairs. At first, the millionaires treated the tasks like novelties. But slowly, something deeper took root. They weren't just passing time, they were learning. For people who had assistants and staff doing everything for them, the act of washing dishes, patching a blanket, or splitting firewood became oddly therapeutic. I forgot what it felt like to use my hands for something real. The app developer confessed while stacking logs, not just typing on a screen, and I forgot how satisfying it is to finish something yourself, Claire admitted as she tied off a repaired seam. Margaret, watching quietly, smiled. Hard work's not so bad when you share it. That evening, after another shared meal, the group gathered around the fire. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, knitting, while the others lounged on blankets and cushions. The room glowed golden in the candlelight. It was David who spoke first. "You know, Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "you remind me of my grandmother. She raised me when my parents were too busy running the family business. She never cared about money, she cared about moments, meals. Sitting together, like this." Margaret looked at him warmly. Sounds like she had her priorities right. One by one, the others began to share similar stories. Childhood memories of warmth and love, before wealth complicated their lives. Times when happiness came not from possessions but from people. For hours they talked, the fire crackled, the storm raged, and in that little house the walls between them grew thinner and thinner. At one point, Claire leaned her head against Vanessa's shoulder and whispered, "I feel lighter here. Like I can finally breathe." Vanessa nodded. "Me too. It's strange, isn't it? We're millionaires, but we've never felt this rich." Margaret overheard, but she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She only kept knitting, her quiet presence like a thread stitching them all together. Later, when most had drifted into sleep, David stayed awake by the fire. He watched Margaret carefully, studying her lined face, her steady hands, the way she carried herself with dignity despite her modest surroundings. "You've done more for us in 3 days than most people with 10 mansions would ever do," he murmured. Margaret only smiled. "Kindness doesn't cost a thing, David. You'd be surprised how far it goes." For a moment, his throat tightened. He hadn't felt this kind of humility in years. Perhaps decades. And though he didn't know it yet, the seed of something extraordinary had just been planted inside him. Inside all of them. The storm outside raged on. But inside, the house glowed with something stronger than fire. The warmth of kindness. The storm showed no mercy. By the 4th night, the snow had buried cars up to their roofs and sealed the main road into Maplewood under drifts taller than a man. No one was going anywhere. Inside Margaret's small house, however, the world felt strangely fuller than it had in years. The fire roared warmly, flames dancing in the hearth, shadows flickering on the faces of 15 people who might otherwise have never crossed paths. They sat in a loose circle on the floor, their bowls of stew empty, their bellies warmed by bread and coffee. And slowly, as the hours ticked by, stories began to spill like secrets uncorked from long-forgotten bottles. It was David who spoke first. His voice was low, almost reluctant. "When I was young," he said, staring into the flames, "I thought money was the answer to everything. I built my empire stone by stone, deal by deal. And when I finally made it, when the newspapers called me the youngest billionaire in New York, I thought I'd won." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But the night I signed that deal, I went home to an empty apartment. My parents were gone, my marriage was failing, and I couldn't even remember the last time I sat at a table with someone who cared about me, not my bank account." Silence stretched across the room. No one had ever heard David Lancaster speak this way, not even those who knew him best. Margaret rocked gently in her chair, knitting in her lap, listening as though his confession was no different than a neighbor telling her about the weather. Next, Claire cleared her throat. "I know that emptiness," she said. Her sister Vanessa glanced at her, surprised. Claire rarely admitted weakness. Claire's voice trembled. "We built our fashion line together, Vanessa and I. We became the darlings of London, glamorous, powerful, untouchable. But in chasing that I left someone behind, a man I loved. He wanted a simple life. I told him I couldn't live without ambition. He told me I wouldn't know how to live without love." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "I chose ambition. And I've been wondering ever since if I made the worst mistake of my life." Vanessa took her sister's hand. For all their differences, for all their shared success, she'd never seen Claire so raw. "You've carried that for years," Vanessa whispered. Claire nodded silently. The football star spoke next, his booming voice softened by weariness. "I had everything a man could want, fame, fortune, fans chanting my name. But when the stadium lights went out, I went home to painkillers, ice packs, and an empty silence. The body breaks, but the silence," he swallowed hard. "The silence breaks the soul." One by one, the others followed. The shipping magnate admitted he barely knew his grandchildren because business always came first. The app developer confessed his billion-dollar company felt like a prison, keeping him tethered to screens while real life slipped away. The venture capitalist, gruff and proud, finally muttered that he hadn't spoken to his brother in 10 years. Not since they fought over an inheritance neither of them needed. Margaret listened to them all, her needles clicking softly. She didn't interrupt, she didn't judge. She only gave them space to say what they had perhaps never dared to say out loud. Finally someone turned to her. David, eyes soft, asked, "And what about you, Mrs. Collins? What story do you carry?" Margaret paused, setting her knitting aside. She looked into the fire, her face illuminated by the glow. "My story isn't glamorous," she said gently. "I married young. My husband was a kind man, a factory worker. We didn't have much, but we had enough. When he died, heart attack at 42. I thought my life had ended too. But I had 2 children looking up at me, waiting for dinner, waiting for comfort. So I got up the next day and went to work. I scrubbed floors, washed sheets, ironed suits. I worked until my hands ached and my back burned. And I raised those children the best I could." Her voice softened even more. "They're grown now, far away, with lives of their own. I live here alone. I don't have riches, but I have peace. And sometimes," she smiled faintly, "sometimes peace is worth more than gold." The fire crackled, the only sound in the heavy silence that followed. Several of the millionaires lowered their heads, ashamed of the wealth that had never bought them what this woman carried so effortlessly. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered was the circle of warmth, the truth shared, and the realization dawning on each of them they were richer in money, but she was richer in spirit. It was Vanessa who finally broke the silence. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Imagine this, 15 millionaires trapped in a housekeeper's cottage, and we're the ones learning how to live." Everyone laughed, the tension breaking. The fire snapped and popped, as though approving. The night stretched on, but no one felt the urge to sleep. For once, they weren't CEOs, athletes, or moguls. They weren't competitors or icons. They were simply people, flawed, lonely human, finding a strange kind of healing in a house that shouldn't have been big enough to hold them, yet somehow was. By the time the flames burned low, many of them realized something they would never forget: the wealth they guarded so fiercely had kept them comfortable, but never truly warm. And warmth, real warmth, was what they had found here, in the presence of a woman who gave without expecting a thing in return. The wind began to scream just after dusk. It wasn't the steady howl of the last few days, but a violent, tearing sound, as though the storm itself had grown angry. Snow whipped against the windows in furious bursts. The shutters rattled so hard Margaret feared they might tear free. Inside, the atmosphere tightened. The fire still burned, but the warmth of the previous nights gave way to unease. It was the 4th night of the storm, and exhaustion had begun to show. The millionaires shifted restlessly. They weren't used to confinement. Some paced the small living room, others sat silently, lost in their thoughts. Even laughter, which had filled the house before, came only in short bursts before fading into uneasy silence. It was Claire who finally spoke. "How much longer can this go on?" Her voice trembled, betraying the tension clawing at her chest. Margaret set another log on the fire. "Storms always end. They can be long, but they don't last forever." Her calm steadied some, but not all. The venture capitalist, who had been the most restless since day one, snapped. "Easy for you to say. You're used to this. I've got businesses running on 6 continents, and I'm stuck here wasting time in a cottage while millions bleed away every day." His voice cracked against the walls, louder than the wind outside. Everyone turned. The silence that followed was suffocating. David's jaw tightened. "You think your money matters right now? If Margaret hadn't opened her door, you'd be dead in a snowbank. Does that sound like profit to you?" The man glared. "You don't understand." "No." David cut him off sharply. "You don't understand. None of us do. That's why we're here. To learn." For a moment, it seemed the venture capitalist might explode, but his shoulders finally slumped. He turned away, muttering under his breath. The tension lingered. The storm raged louder. And then, just as the group began to settle back into uneasy quiet, a loud crack split the night. Margaret jumped to her feet. That was the roof. They rushed to the hallway, where snow had pressed heavy against the shingles. A section of wood groaned under the weight, threatening to give. If it collapsed, the house would be exposed to the storm. Without hesitation, the football star grabbed a broom and began pushing at the sagging section. "We need to lighten it from inside." David and the shipping magnate joined him, bracing beams with chairs, reinforcing the pressure point. The app developer, hands shaking, ferried buckets as Margaret ordered snow melted down and poured outside to lessen the weight. For over an hour they worked like a team. Grunting, straining, sweating despite the cold. Wealth didn't matter here. Titles didn't matter, only effort, only survival. When the roof finally steadied and the groaning stopped, they collapsed against the walls, panting. Vanessa wiped her forehead, laughing breathlessly. "I don't think I've ever worked that hard in my life." Margaret smiled faintly. Storms have a way of reminding us what we're capable of. But the night wasn't done testing them. Around midnight, the firewood pile ran dangerously low. The men had underestimated how quickly the storm would drain their reserves. Without fire, the house would freeze before morning. "I'll go," David said firmly, pulling on his coat. "No," Margaret stopped him. "It's too dangerous. You'll lose your way in the snow." "I'll take the football star with me," David argued. "We'll be quick." The football star nodded, already reaching for his gloves. "We can handle it." Margaret hesitated, torn between fear and necessity. Finally she relented. "Take the lantern. And stay close together." The two men disappeared into the night. The wind swallowed them instantly, their silhouettes vanishing into white. The house felt colder without them. Minutes dragged like hours. Vanessa wrung her hands. Claire whispered prayers under her breath. Even the venture capitalist paced with real fear, no longer grumbling about profits. When at last the lantern's glow appeared again through the storm, relief swept through the house like fresh air. David and the football star stumbled back inside, faces raw from the wind, arms piled with logs. They dropped the wood by the hearth, laughing in exhausted triumph. Margaret hugged them both without hesitation, tears shining in her eyes. "Foolish men," she scolded softly. "But brave ones." That night, huddled tighter than ever, the group endured. The fire burned steady, the roof held, and the walls of Margaret's home remained strong against the fury outside. Yet it wasn't the storm that had tested them most, it was themselves. Their tempers, their fears, their fragility when stripped of control. And they had survived, not because of their wealth, not because of their power, but because they had chosen for once to lean on each other. When dawn crept in through frosted windows, the storm was still raging. But inside, something had shifted again. The millionaires, tired, sore and strangely humbled, looked at one another with the quiet realization that they had faced the longest night of their lives. And they hadn't done it alone. The first hint of morning was not the sun, it was silence. After days of howling wind and walls shuddering under snow, the sudden stillness was almost unsettling. The house seemed to hold its breath. Margaret awoke first, blinking against the pale glow seeping through frosted glass. She sat up slowly, her bones aching from nights spent on the floor beside her guests. For a moment she thought her ears had deceived her. But no, the storm had finally broken. She hurried to the window and scraped away a patch of frost with her sleeve. Her heart gave a small leap. The sky was clearing, a soft pink ribbon stretching over the horizon. Snow still blanketed everything in thick drifts, but the world beyond the glass looked calm at last. Behind her, the millionaires stirred awake one by one. David rubbed his eyes, then followed her gaze to the window. "It's over," he whispered almost reverently. One by one, the others crowded behind him, pressing close to see. For the first time in days, hope flickered across their faces. They were safe, alive, and the world outside was no longer a prison of white chaos but a sparkling canvas of untouched snow. Margaret smiled faintly. "I told you storms don't last forever." The group laughed quietly, relief threading through the sound. They spent the next hour digging a path to the front door. The snow was waist deep, heavy and stubborn, but they worked together as if it were second nature now. Passing shovels, pushing aside drifts, cheering one another on when arms grew tired. When at last they cleared enough space, Margaret pushed open the door. The cold air rushed in, sharp and biting, but it carried a freshness that felt like a blessing. They stepped outside in awe. The world stretched before them unrecognizable. Trees sagged under glittering coats of ice, rooftops hunched beneath heavy snow, and the road was buried in silence. It looked like another planet. The football star whistled low. "Man, it's like we're the only people left alive." For a while they simply stood, breathing it all in. Then, as the sun rose higher, something strange began to happen. A faint hum. At first so soft Margaret thought she imagined it. Then louder. A low, steady rumble carried on the frozen air. "What's that?" Vanessa asked, frowning. David's brow furrowed. "Engines." They turned toward the horizon. At first, nothing but glittering snow. Then, tiny shapes appeared, moving in a long line down the white blanketed road. "Cars, dozens of them." "No way," whispered the app developer. The sound grew louder as the line of vehicles drew nearer. Sleek black sedans, polished SUVs, even a few limousines, all carving a path through the snow like a fleet on a mission. And not a handful, not a dozen. More. Margaret's breath caught as she began to count. 20, 40, 80. By the time the convoy reached the cottage road, her hands trembled. 135. The snow crackled under their tires as the cars came to a slow, coordinated stop outside Margaret's tiny home. Doors flew open in near-perfect unison, and men in dark coats stepped out. Drivers, security, assistants. Behind them, more figures emerged. Reporters, cameramen, photographers. Flashes lit the morning like fireworks. The millionaires stared, stunned into silence. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "They found us." The venture capitalist shook his head slowly, as if trying to wake from a dream. "No, they came for us." Margaret's confusion deepened. What is happening? Who are these people? The truth unfolded in fragments. Security teams rushed to the group, greeting them with relief, explaining that when news of the storm broke, global networks had reported multiple high-profile figures missing. Panic spread across industries, governments, entire nations. For days, private search parties and helicopters scoured the region. No one had expected to find them alive in a modest house at the edge of town. Margaret listened, her hands clasped tight before her apron. She felt suddenly small, standing among men and women whose names appeared on magazine covers and stock reports. They weren't just wealthy travelers, they were titans, leaders of corporations, icons in sports, media and technology, and they had all been in her home, sleeping on her floor, sharing her bread, laughing beside her fire. Reporters surged forward shouting questions. Cameras clicked like hungry birds. The millionaires squinted against the onslaught, some raising hands to shield their faces. It was chaos, until David turned, not toward the press, but toward Margaret. His voice rose above the noise. "Wait." The crowd fell still, sensing the weight in his tone. David pointed toward the small, weathered woman standing in the doorway of her cottage. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her apron dusted with snow, her eyes wide with bewilderment. "This woman," he said firmly, "saved our lives." Every camera swung toward Margaret. The flashes blinded her, but she didn't move. Her heart hammered in her chest. "She took in 15 strangers with nothing to gain," David continued. "She gave us her food, her fire, her faith. Without her, none of us would be here this morning. Not one." The football star stepped forward. "Hez right. Forget our money, our names. Out here, that didn't matter. She kept us alive when all we had was each other." One by one the others added their voices. "She gave us shelter. She reminded us of kindness. She showed us what humanity still means." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. She wanted to protest, to say she had only done what any decent person would have, but their words wrapped around her like a blanket, heavy with gratitude. And then, something extraordinary happened. The 135 cars, drivers, assistants, staff, began to applaud. A ripple at first, then a wave, then a thunderous roar of clapping hands echoing through the snow-covered valley. Margaret stood frozen, tears spilling freely now. She had never felt smaller, she had never felt larger. The applause didn't stop. Not when the reporters joined in. Not when the millionaires themselves raised their hands in tribute. It was a sound she would never forget. The storm had ended. And something far greater had begun. The applause finally softened into silence, though the air still vibrated with its echoes. Margaret stood in the doorway, dazed, her hands clutching her apron as if it might anchor her to the earth. She had never been the center of attention in her life. She was a housekeeper, a widow. A woman who lived quietly on the edge of town, tending to other people's homes while scraping together enough to keep her own roof standing. And now here she was, surrounded by cameras, flashing lights, and some of the most powerful people on earth, all looking at her as if she were something greater than herself. "Margaret," David said gently, stepping closer. "There's something you should know." She blinked at him, startled by the gravity in his voice. "These people, they're not just millionaires, they're..." He hesitated, searching her face, then glanced at the group behind him. One by one, they nodded, as if giving permission. "They're some of the most influential leaders in the world." Margaret frowned. "I don't understand." The venture capitalist, his arrogance tempered now by exhaustion and humility, spoke up. "My name isn't just Edward, it's Edward Hale. I run one of the largest private equity firms in the US. My decisions move billions every week." Vanessa stepped forward next. Her smile was soft, almost apologetic. "Vanessa Carrington, Hollywood producer, actress. You might have seen my face somewhere, though I'm sure I wasn't half as memorable as the meals you cooked us." The football star rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Darnell Brooks. Super Bowl champion. Guess I wasn't much use without my stadium." One by one they revealed themselves. The shipping magnate whose fleets connected continents. The tech developer behind an app used by half the globe. The oil baron's daughter whose family name carried weight in boardrooms from London to Dubai. The quiet woman who turned out to be CEO of a pharmaceutical empire. Margaret's head spun. She recognized many of the names now that they were spoken aloud. She had seen them in newspapers, on television, in headlines she skimmed while dusting other people's living rooms. And all this time they had been in her home, sitting cross-legged on her floor, laughing over her stew, huddled beside her fireplace like children. She swayed slightly and David caught her arm to steady her. His eyes were kind, steady. "And me, I wasn't entirely honest either. I'm David Armstrong." Her brow furrowed. "That name?" He gave a small nod. "Yes, Armstrong International. My father built it, I run it now." Margaret's lips parted but no sound came. Armstrong International. She had cleaned houses where that name was spoken with reverence, with envy. It was a dynasty, an empire. And yet this man had spent the storm chopping firewood, carrying water, laughing with her over burnt bread. Her voice trembled. Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Vanessa answered softly. "Because in here, it didn't matter. Out there, everyone treats us like something we're not. But with you we were just people. And for once that was enough." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. She shook her head, overwhelmed. "But the cars, all of those cars." David glanced at the convoy behind them and back to her. His tone was gentle but weighted with meaning. "Those cars aren't just for us. They're for you." Her breath caught. "For me?" "Yes," he said. "Because the world is about to know your name. They've come to cover your story." The reporters surged again, shouting questions. "Margaret, did you know who you were sheltering? How does it feel to have saved the lives of 15 global leaders? What was the first thing you told them when they arrived at your door?" Margaret stumbled back, her chest tight. I didn't, I was just doing what anyone would have done." "No," Vanessa said firmly, stepping beside her. Not everyone would have done what you did. Most people would have turned us away, too afraid to share what little they had. But you opened your door. You gave us everything. That's why we're here. That's why they came. The group of millionaires turned, almost as one, to face the reporters. Their words rang out in clear voices, echoing across the snow. She saved our lives. She gave us shelter when no one else could. She showed us humanity still matters. The cameras drank it in, flashes bursting like stars. Margaret felt dizzy, the world around her tilted, filled with noise, praise, and names that once lived only on the pages of newspapers. And through it all, she stood in her threadbare coat, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring. She only knew that her life, quiet, ordinary, hidden in the margins, had shifted forever. The snow was melting, but something far bigger had begun to rise.